So, hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jeanette Hodges. I'm Head of Carbon and Operations at Orbit. We have about 40,000 homes across England, from the Midlands down across the south and the east of England. And I am the lead on our demonstrator, our 2 Wave 1 projects, and hopefully our up and coming Wave 2 project as well.
Thank you. I'm Fallon Warren, Senior Retrofit Building Surveyor, Orbit, funnily enough. And I work with Jeanette on our SHDF projects, both the demonstrator, 2 Wave 1 projects, and again, hopefully for the Wave 2. And that is frontline delivery, as well as looking at our strategy on hard to treat properties moving forward. So a quick overview of what we're going to look at in the next, 20 minutes, 25 minutes is an overview of our SHDF projects, a little bit in depth of expect the unexpected, so what we found, what to look out for in your own projects, and then Jeanette will pick up on our actual planning approach, how we've had to adapt that, and looking at some examples of different outcomes from our planning applications over the projects. So our SHDF projects, we had a demonstrator project that's just come to a conclusion. That was 69 properties within the Stratford district area. Wave 1 is 136 properties, predominantly with Stratford and then in the wider West Midlands area. Both projects are a mix of bungalows and houses, so a traditional construction type, but a mix of archetypes within that, and a real mix of property build dates, so early properties, 1900s, 1920s, of solid wall construction, ranging all the way through up to 1990 with various sizes of cavity walls. We have used Parity as a software to model different scenarios on what measures our properties could take. Ultimately, we have done it from a fabric first approach, and we also went with our worst first, so our lowest performing properties with EPCs of E's, F's and G's, and then Wave 1 has brought in our EPC Band D properties as well. As you can see on the screen, we have looked at numerous measures on what we can do to our properties to make them future-proof and improve them for our customers that are living in the property. So a range of insulation types for external wall, cavity wall, and also some internal wall insulation. I will say we haven't moved customers out of our properties. We have done all of these works with customers in situ. So customer engagement has been a real key to getting those measures in place and making those properties better and future-proofed. We've looked at vapor control barriers, ventilation strategies, improved loft insulation, also looked at heating types with a focus on not causing any disruption to customers and also not increasing their fuel bills. We've actually turned that round and looked at energy demand. So we haven't wanted to increase their prices, but are there any measures we can do to reduce their energy demand and not put them into fuel poverty or make the situation worse? We've put in high performing windows and doors, intelligent heating controls, but also controls that allow us to measure what's going on in the property, such as humidity levels. So instead of us relying on customers to tell us what's happening with that property, we've got artificial intelligence, so we can look and we can monitor what's going on, and we can take a real proactive approach to that. And then last but not least, any form of renewables that we can put on those properties, such as solar voltaic panels, battery storage, those sorts of things that will help to get us to where we need to and meet the targets required. So a little bit on expect the unexpected. Data and dwelling assessments, these are 2 fundamentals for any project. So having data up front, kind of knowing your properties, being able to model those properties from a data point of view, having up-to-date data is really key, because then you will move on to what has 2035 prescribed as dwelling assessments. And these are surveys, building surveys, so you can fundamentally have a base point of knowing how your properties are performing. So you'd be looking for size, construction, occupancy, looking at any defects to the property. Also, I'll point out looking at any services that are attached to the property, such as overhead cables, any access requirements or restrictions, site constraints. All of those will affect how you're going to pull your project together, and ultimately how and what you can do to that property, especially when you've got really tight project timescales, and also what you think might be a really straightforward project or property may become very complex when you've got to look at various routes to go down before you can even put a foot on the ground. We also had conflicting market conditions. So when we say that, we all know that material shot up in price. We've paid more now than what we did 12, 18 months ago, a variance of up to 14, 16% on materials. The other thing to consider is there's lots of us undertaking these retrofit projects. We're all dipping into the same pool of resource. So there is a real frontline shortage on skilled workforces. So collaboration may be key moving forward. I won't touch on planning because Jeanette's going to go into that in more detail. But that's an overview of where we are, what we found, and how we've overcome them a little bit. So I will pass over to Jeanette to give you some more information and in depth about how we've adapted our approach to planning.
Great, thank you. So we've just heard that being prepared and planning ahead is crucial for any retrofit project. I'm going to take a closer look at the impact planning has had on our project. We certainly don't have all the answers, but hopefully our insight and experience today will give you some tips and some points for consideration when planning your projects. If you want to understand more about the technical aspects of planning and the planning process in detail, I'd recommend you take a look at the Planning Applications Masterclass, which is also available on the SHRA website. So these are some of the properties that we finished on our demonstrator project. For those not familiar with the area, Stratford-on-Avon has over 75 designated conservation areas, 3,000 listed buildings, as well as areas of outstanding natural beauty. Now, none of the properties in our project were listed or within conservation areas. However, we did need to apply for full planning permission or lawful development certificates for the majority of properties, and that's been a challenge for us both in terms of time and cost. We also had a diverse mix of archetypes that you can see there. We had different building finishes, and this meant we had to be flexible with our approach. So looking at the before and after photographs, and if you're in doubt, the befores are on the top row, you can see some of the finishes that we needed to apply to satisfy planning. On the left, we had to do full effect render, and I think hopefully you agree the bottom photograph is a pretty good like for like. In the middle, we have full white render, and then a mix of half render and half brick effect. We also used a technique called art brick. That's not shown here, but it exactly replicates the finishes on original bricks. So it's really useful for older buildings where perhaps you've got some bricks that are discoloured from soot, or if you have a mix of colours within those bricks. It's worth noting, though, that if you do need to go down the art brick route for planning conditions, it's significantly more expensive, about 4 times the cost of plain render. And there's a limited amount of PASS accredited installers that can do that finish. It was originally suggested that we use brick slips on our properties to protect the streetscape. That was the planner's recommendation, but brick slips are much more expensive than a render finish, and they have a long lead time. During our project, we were quoted a 20-week lead time. So looking then at lessons learned, Well, we've already stressed the importance of data and knowing your properties, and this is especially important when it comes to planning. When completing those dwelling assessments that Fallon mentioned, look at the street your property's in. What precedents have been set in terms of other works completed? Are other properties within that street rendered? Just take a look around when you go there. The current streetscape really can be a useful gauge as to whether you're likely to get planning permission that meets your aspirations. Don't assume that planning won't be required, and also don't assume that you're going to be able to obtain pre-application advice from your local authority. Stratford District Council were co-sponsors of our demonstrator project, and they were extremely helpful. But at the time, the planning department were working on COVID-19 emergency measures, and their limited resources meant that they couldn't offer pre-application advice. We had to proceed straight to full application or lawful development certificates, and then amend during the process if required. Again, that just added time and workload pressure during the project. We did RAG rate our properties really early on in the project to understand our risks, and that helped us to prioritise areas such as planning. But despite this, the planning process for us took almost 9 months from start to finish. If your project does have particularly tight timelines, and we know that many of the SHDF projects do, you need to have planning in place right from the outset. If you don't, then maybe consider alternatives such as cavity wall insulation. You might just find that you can achieve a good performance outcome and also better value for money. It's going to be less disruptive, less expensive, and reduce your time on site. And in most cases, you won't need planning for that. Another alternative might be internal wall insulation, but that can be difficult for a number of reasons, not least if the property is tenanted, as it's extremely disruptive. But also you might find some properties are too small. Staircases always seem to be on the external walls when you don't want them to be. And if you need to do, for example, IWI, internal wall insulation in kitchens and bathrooms, again, this is going to be costly, disruptive, and isn't really sustainable if these components aren't due for replacement. If you do have properties such as these, you might want to consider including those in a project which has a longer timeline. Fallon mentioned looking at the utilities to your property. It's not a planning issue, but if you do have, for example, overhead cables, again, just consider these in advance of works and coordinate the various parties involved. Also consider whether boundary lines or party wall notices might require further investigation, and again, build this into your programme early on. You'll find that PAS 2035 can be a really helpful framework for addressing some of these issues. You can, for example, take the opportunity to speak to a resident about the need for planning when speaking with them about the retrofit measures, and then it won't come as a surprise to them when they see a planning application notice go up on their lamppost outside. So based on these lessons, what advice and tips can we offer? Well, we stress the need for data, and I make no apologies for repeating this again. That standardised retrofit assessment will assist and give clarity to all parties regarding compliance with PAS 2035. These should be really detailed and include full measured surveys, and the full measured surveys can then be used to support your planning application. Do engage with your local planning authority, find out whether they'll offer you pre-application advice. If they won't, or if you're in doubt whether your work falls under permitted development, then you might want to consider a lawful development certificate as an alternative to full planning. It does fall under the same timelines, but it will give you that assurance and it's less expensive. Also consider using a planning consultant. They can be really helpful to guide you through the process, advise whether you're likely to achieve your aspirations for the property, and if necessary, you can then adapt your plans accordingly. The planning consultant that we used, they'd previously worked within the Stratford planning team, so he was very familiar with the area, which was helpful, and also knew what was likely to be acceptable to the planners. Those relationships are key. Really try to develop a long-term relationship with your local planning teams if you can. Explain your project, explain your strategic objectives and the timelines that you're working to. We included a copy of press releases that we'd done in our application to give the project background and context. And since the project's been finished, we have managed to meet with the planners out on site and talk to them about our aspirations, ready for wave 1 and the forthcoming wave 2. Don't forget your residents' engagement. It's really important when you go out to site. Don't tell, show people, show your residents what the end result's going to look like. And by that, I mean it's really useful to take samples of brick effect render or plain render with you, show them what the colour is going to be like, what the finish is. Take supporting visualisations as well so they can see what their home will look like after the work. Don't forget the neighbours, let them know what's planned, and you could also take the opportunity to discuss party wall and boundary matters at the same time. You'll hopefully find that this approach will help to prevent objections and avoid the planner potentially requesting a change to your finish, such as requiring brick effect, or even stop them turning down your application as a result of objections. We submitted our planning in phases, so we're able to learn what would and wouldn't be acceptable and adopt subsequent phases of application. This reduced both our costs where planning wasn't required. It also mitigated against potential refusals. Although we couldn't do pre-application discussions, the planning team did actually engage with us during the application process. So we were able to adapt plans as we worked through the process and then resubmit them again without impacting on our timelines. We also submitted planning geographically. That enabled us to batch applications and also to submit multiple applications, which does save a little bit on those planning fees. If the outside finish of your property is going to change, for example, if you're going from brick to render, you will need to submit visualisations. We would normally use our in-house graphic team for this, but they couldn't work to our timelines on the project, so we had to outsource this. Again, that's just something to consider because that did add an additional cost to our project. And finally, we always say this, but always have a plan B, C, D, and probably through to Z. We recommend having a reserve list of properties that you can use to substitute as appropriate, just to plan for those unknowns that Fallon mentioned. You might always also find that different planners within the same local authority will take a different approach. So do be flexible, do be prepared to adapt your plans. What you're trying to avoid is a planning refusal, especially when your project is time critical. So pre-planning and preparation will be key to success. So I hope this has been useful and good luck with your project.